The cafe was louder than usual that afternoon. The air buzzed with casual chatter and the clinking of silverware against mugs. Steam drifted lazily from the espresso machine, filling the room with the familiar scent of roasted beans and warm milk. Sunlight poured in through the tall glass windows, splintering across the wooden tables and glinting off spoon handles, making the entire place feel brighter than the gray world outside. Emily sat in her usual corner, tucked close to the window where she could watch the world go by. Her half-finished latte had gone cold, and the open notebook in front of her remained blank. She had been staring at that same empty page for nearly an hour, waiting for the right words to find her. Once, they used to come so easily. Words had been her escape, her delight, the piece of herself that always made sense when nothing else did, but life had slowed that energy into something muted. Work had consumed her days, silence her nights, and the spaces in between had begun to feel too familiar. Everything, routine, dependable, tired, had blurred together. She sighed quietly and reached for her pen, then gave up again. Maybe tomorrow, she told herself. Maybe tomorrow the words would return. Just as she began to close the notebook, a flash of movement at the door caught her attention. A man had stepped inside, brushing the wind off his shoulders. He carried a worn brown leather bag that hung diagonally across his chest, the strap faded from use. His eyes scanned the room as if he were searching for a place to land, or perhaps a reason to stay. He was tall, with dark hair that fell just slightly into his eyes, and carried himself with the kind of quiet presence that didn't ask for attention but earned it anyway. There was a steadiness to him, an ease in the way he moved through the bustle, neither hurried nor hesitant. Every table was taken, except the one across from her. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. It wasn't long, but it was long enough for Emily to feel something tighten gently in her chest, a flicker of awareness, the subtle shock of being seen. He approached her table with a politeness that didn't feel rehearsed. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, a small smile playing at his lips. "Seems I'm out of options." His voice was low, steady, with the kind of warmth that could calm noise into quiet. Emily's first instinct was hesitation, but before she could think of an excuse, she found herself gesturing to the empty seat. "Go ahead," she said. He set his bag down carefully and slid into the chair opposite her. For a moment, all that passed between them was the rhythmic hum of the cafe, the hiss of milk frothing, the distant tap of the barista's shoes against the floor. It was he who broke the silence first. He glanced at her notebook and then met her gaze once more. "Writer?" Something about how he said it made her smile, a soft reflex she hadn't felt in a while. "Trying to be," she admitted, returning his smile. "That makes two of us, in a sense," he said, leaning slightly back in his chair. "I'm a photographer. Same battle, just with different tools. Trying to catch a moment that actually feels true." His honesty caught her off guard, the kind that didn't sound like small talk. Emily glanced up, studying him quietly. There was a tiredness in his eyes, yes, but it wasn't hollow. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from chasing something that mattered. Beneath that fatigue lived warmth, a quiet sincerity she couldn't help but notice. He told her his name was Daniel, that he was from Vancouver, in town for just a few days. He spoke easily but never boastfully, and there was a gentleness in his movements, from the way he rested his hand near his coffee cup to how he looked at her when she answered. Emily hadn't intended to converse. She had come to the cafe to disappear into background noise, to drown out her own thoughts. Yet, with him sitting there, words flowed more freely than they had in months. She found herself telling him about her habit of coming here after work, about how the noise of clinking cups steadied her nerves better than silence. She confessed shyly her frustration with the blank pages, and how lately, every story she started ended the same way, unfinished. It was rare for her to admit such things to anyone, even rarer that she felt safe enough to. But Daniel listened differently. He didn't nod perfunctorily or glance away. When he looked at her, it was with focus, like she was the only person in that crowded cafe. When it was his turn to speak, he did so with simplicity, but each word carried weight. He told her about his travels, cities he'd wandered, faces he'd photographed, mornings spent chasing light in places that felt both thrilling and lonely. He smiled faintly as he spoke, and though his tone was casual, Emily heard what lived beneath it, a longing still unresolved. Minutes slipped into an hour, and then longer. They didn't notice. At some point, the golden light outside faded toward dusk. The cafe that had been teeming with customers now emptied to a murmur. When Emily finally glanced down at her wristwatch, she startled. Wow, I didn't realize how late it's gotten." Daniel smiled faintly. "Sorry," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Didn't mean to steal your whole afternoon." She shook her head, a little laugh escaping her. "You didn't steal anything? I didn't have much to lose." The playfulness of her words contrasted with something fragile behind them. Something he seemed to understand instantly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his palms loose but steady. "You know people come and go," he said, voice quiet now. "But this doesn't feel like one of those short crossings." Her breathing stilled for a beat. His voice was matter of fact, but his eyes carried an honesty that made her pulse skip. She opened her mouth to reply, but nothing came out. So she only smiled faintly, letting the silence bridge what words couldn't. Something gentle passed between them, unspoken, yet real. For the first time in a long stretch of gray days, Emily felt her heart stir with light, all because a stranger had needed a seat. The crowd thinned. The once busy cafe softened to murmurs. A few tables remained scattered with empty mugs, and the smell of roasted coffee beans still lingered in the air. Emily noticed none of it. Her attention kept circling back to Daniel. He had a way of leaning forward just enough to show genuine interest, yet not so much that she felt cornered by it. She watched him as he spoke, noticing the calm in his voice when he asked about her writing, the curiosity that didn't carry judgment, only interest. Their conversation, which had begun with half-hearted jokes about caffeine addictions and unfinished notes, slowly spiraled into deeper things. Emily told him more than she meant to, about her fear of mediocrity, of living a half-lived life. How she used to fill notebook after notebook with stories, and how now, no matter how she tried, her mind went blank. She laughed nervously when she said it, but he didn't. He listened like it wasn't a flaw, just another truth. When he spoke again, it wasn't to fix her or comfort her with empty words. He shared instead pieces of himself. "I take all these pictures," he said, picking up his coffee cup. "And sometimes when I look back, I wonder if I'm collecting memories or hiding inside them." There was no pretense in his tone, just quiet honesty. Emily smiled, though it faltered slightly. "Don't you ever get tired of starting over?" The question slipped from her lips like an accident. He considered it for a moment before answering, his eyes flicking toward the window where people were crossing the street under amber streetlights. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but every place teaches me something. Every face reminds me of something I thought I forgot. Maybe that's why I keep going. Because as long as I can still notice things, I'm alive." She nodded slowly, her heart stirring with understanding she hadn't expected. They talked until the daylight faded completely. Daniel reached into his worn leather bag and took out a camera, an old one, heavy and scratched around the edges. When he placed it on the table, it looked like it carried a lifetime of stories. "This is how I see the world," he said, as if it were the simplest truth. Emily leaned closer as he turned the camera screen toward her, scrolling through photos, candid faces, quiet landscapes, intimate slices of life. A woman smiling beneath a broken umbrella in Mexico City, a child chasing pigeons between cobblestones in Venice, a fog-drenched sunrise over the mountains in British Columbia. They weren't just pictures, they were moments, each holding something delicate and human. "They're beautiful," she whispered. Daniel shook his head slightly. "They're just moments. The beauty is in noticing them." His words landed softly, but carried weight. Emily glanced down at her blank notebook, realizing suddenly that for months, she had been waiting for perfection instead of paying attention to the world around her. For the first time, She understood what she'd lost, and what she might have just found. They drifted easily from heavy subjects to light ones. Childhood memories, childhood fears, favorite films, long-forgotten dreams. Daniel had a subtle humor she hadn't expected, and each time she laughed, he looked at her like the sound mattered. By the time the cafe dimmed its lights for closing, 3 hours had passed unnoticed. Emily sighed, reluctant. "I should probably go," she said, closing her notebook at last. Daniel smiled, tilting his head. There was a quiet hope flickering behind his expression. "Of course." A pause, then softer. "But I don't want this to be just an afternoon." The words hung in the air, gentle but certain. Her chest tightened, as if her heart wasn't quite ready for the possibility they carried. She wanted to say something, to agree, to confess that she felt the same. But fear crept in. Instead, she offered him a small, uncertain smile, one that couldn't hide her racing pulse. They gathered their things, and for a long moment before leaving, they simply looked at each other. She didn't know what words could capture what had happened between them, so neither of them tried. Outside, the light had softened to that hazy gray just before dusk. A cool breeze swept through the street as traffic hummed in the background. Emily stepped out onto the sidewalk, feeling something inside her shift. When Daniel turned to say goodbye, the warmth in his gaze steadied her in a way nothing else had in months. That afternoon would stay etched into her. Quiet, unexpected, but life-altering. She didn't know where this connection would lead, or even if she'd see him again. But she knew one thing for certain. Her life had quietly split in two, before and after this conversation. Before him, the days had all blurred together. After him, there was light again. There was still something waiting for her beyond the walls she had built. The door of the cafe closed behind them, and the world felt different. Evening had begun to spread across the city, the light shifting from gold to silver. The air carried a crispness that made Emily pull her coat tighter. Though a quiet warmth still lingered inside her from their hours together, Daniel walked beside her. Not too close, not too far, just enough to make her aware of his presence. The street was alive with people heading home, the sounds of cars and footsteps mixing with a faint scent of roasted chestnuts from a nearby cart. They didn't rush. Their pace was slow, as though neither wanted the afternoon to end too quickly. Emily glanced at Daniel now and then, noticing small details she hadn't before. The way his hands slipped into his coat pockets, the slight curve of his smile when something caught his attention, the thoughtful pause in his steps when he looked around. He seemed to absorb the world instead of just passing through it for a few blocks. They talked about simple things. The changing season, the city's energy, the way Seattle's sky seemed to hold more moods than most people. Daniel pointed at a mural on a brick wall, describing how he would photograph it from a low angle to capture its story. Emily listened, her eyes following his hand. Ash gestured, realizing how alive he seemed when he talked about his craft. Then, as they passed a small bookstore with glowing windows, Daniel stopped. The reflection showed both of them standing side by side, framed by light and glass. He looked at her through the reflection, his voice softer than before. "Do you ever feel like life hands you a moment, and you just know you shouldn't ignore it?" Her breath caught. The question was simple, but it touched something deeper than she expected. She turned to face him, her lips parting as if to answer, but no words came inside her. A storm of feelings stirred curiosity, hope, fear. For years, she had built walls around her heart, telling herself it was safer not to believe in sudden connections. But here with him, she wasn't so sure anymore. Daniel didn't push her to answer. He simply held her gaze, giving her space to feel what she felt. The silence wasn't heavy. It was charged like the quiet before rain. Emily finally managed a small smile, a silent acknowledgement that yes, she felt it too. They walked on, the streets glowing brighter as lamps flickered on. A gentle wind moved through the trees lining the sidewalk, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. Emily thought about how unusual it was to feel so at ease with someone she had only just met. She wasn't used to this kind of closeness, the kind that didn't demand but simply existed. At a street corner, they paused to wait for the light. Emily noticed how Daniel's hand brushed against hers just barely, like an accident that wasn't really one. Her pulse quickened, though, She didn't move away. The moment was fleeting, but it sent a warmth through her chest. They crossed together, their steps falling into rhythm. Daniel told her about a photograph he had once taken in New York. A couple standing under an umbrella in the rain. Unaware of the world around them. "I've always admired that," he said quietly. "The way two people can create their own world." Even in the middle of chaos, Emily's heart stirred at his words. She didn't know if he was speaking of the photograph or of them walking together in this busy city. Either way, she understood. She had spent so much time on the outside of that kind of closeness, wondering if it would ever find her again. Now it felt like maybe it had. The conversation slowed as the night deepened. There were fewer words, more glances, more silences filled with meaning. Emily felt as though she was standing on the edge of something she couldn't yet name. Every step forward was both exciting and frightening, because she knew how easily hope could be broken. When they reached the quieter part of the street, Daniel stopped again. They stood under a lamppost, its light falling gently over them. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful, almost cautious. "I don't know why," he said slowly, "but I feel like meeting you wasn't random. Like maybe this was meant to happen." The honesty in his voice made Emily's throat tighten. She wanted to tell him she felt the same, that she hadn't felt this alive in years, but the words stuck. Instead, she let her eyes speak, hoping he could see everything she couldn't say aloud. For a long moment they stood there, the city moving around them. While time seemed to pause, Emily realized then that this walk wasn't just a walk. It was the beginning of something, fragile but real. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But for the first time in a long time, she wanted to find out. The night had settled across the city, soft and calm. As Emily and Daniel reached the corner, where their paths would separate, streetlights glowed above them, casting halos on the pavement. The world around felt busy, cars passing, people moving. But in that small space, it felt as though only the two of them existed. Emily shifted her notebook under her arm, suddenly aware that leaving meant breaking the fragile spell of the afternoon. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his eyes steady on her. He looked as if he wanted to hold on to every detail. The way her hair moved in the breeze, the faint nervous smile on her lips, the way she seemed caught between staying and leaving. He finally spoke, his voice low but clear. "Emily, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Maybe I'll be in another city. Maybe you'll be buried in your work again. But today, this afternoon, you reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten. That connections like this still exist." Her chest tightened at his words. They weren't dramatic. They weren't rehearsed. They were real. She had spent years convincing herself that love, hope, and trust were things of the past. Stories she used to believe in but no longer dared to touch. Yet here he was speaking with the kind of sincerity that broke through her defenses. She swallowed hard, her voice soft when it finally came. "You've made me see things differently, too." The truth of that statement sank deep inside her. She realized how much she had been holding back from life, how many opportunities she had turned away out of fear of being hurt. But now, after one unexpected afternoon, she felt lighter. It wasn't that her problems had vanished, or that their doubts had disappeared. It was that Daniel had reminded her of possibility. They stood in silence, the kind that didn't demand words. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Can I?" he asked gently, not assuming, just offering. Emily nodded, and they exchanged numbers with a kind of careful hope. As though sealing a fragile promise neither wanted to break. When their phones were back in their pockets, Emily felt a rush of nervousness. "I don't usually do this," she admitted, her cheeks warming. "I don't let people in this quickly." Daniel smiled, the kind of smile that carried understanding instead of judgment. Maybe that's why it matters, because it doesn't happen every day. The words settled between them, simple but meaningful. For a long second, neither moved. Then Emily stepped back slightly, knowing she had to leave, though every part of her wanted to stay. "I should go," she whispered, her voice softer than the night air. Daniel gave a small nod, though his eyes didn't let her go easily. "Good night, Emily," she managed to smile. "Good night, Daniel." Turning away, she began to walk down the street, the sound of her footsteps mixing with the hum of the city. At first, she resisted the urge to look back, afraid the moment would lose its magic if she broke it. But halfway down the block, she allowed herself one glance. Daniel was still there, standing under the lamplight, watching her go. Head didn't wave. He didn't call out. He just stood there as if quietly promising that this wasn't the end. Emily's steps grew lighter. She felt something inside her shift, as though a window had opened in a room that had been closed for years. The air felt fresher, the night less heavy. She clutched her notebook tighter, not because it held words its pages were still blank, but because it now felt like it might finally have something worth writing. As she reached her apartment building, she paused before going in. She thought of the way Daniel had listened, the way he had spoken about life as though it was meant to be noticed and felt, not just endured. She thought of his photographs, the way he captured beauty in fleeting, ordinary moments. And she realized something. Perhaps her own story didn't need to be perfect. Perhaps it only needed to be lived inside her apartment. She set her things down and sat by the window, the city lights glowing in the distance. She opened her notebook, and for the first time in months, the words came, not a polished story, not something ready for anyone else to read, but words that felt alive. She wrote about the cafe, the golden afternoon, the unexpected meeting, and the stranger who no longer felt like one. Hours later, when she finally closed the notebook, she felt different. She felt awake. Across town, Daniel walked back to his hotel, replaying the afternoon in his mind. He thought about her laughter, her honesty, the way she had looked at them as though she saw more than most people ever did. He wasn't sure where life would take him next, but he knew one thing. This wasn't just a passage encounter. Something about Emily had left a mark he couldn't ignore. That night, as they both lay in their separate rooms, sleep came slowly, but with a strange comfort. Neither knew what tomorrow would hold, but they carried with them the certainty that some meetings change everything. And for Emily, the truth was clear. What happened that afternoon had made her see things differently. It had reminded her that life wasn't just about existing. It was about feeling, risking, and letting light back in.